So if I hit, okay. We're good for me. You're good?
I don't quite see your
Okay.
screen yet, but I think it will be coming in a moment.
You don't need to show my screen. I just wanted to make sure I could do it.
Okay.
So you can take it back if you need to, like.
Okay. I'll take it back for a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome everyone. Everyone should be in the mute only mode, and if you have any questions, please do type them in the chat box. We'll also use the chat box for questions. So thank you for joining the Bike Walk Civics webinar series. This is the second in the series of 5. We want to thank the Wisconsin Bike Fed and the American Heart Association for supporting this. Today's session is navigating government processes, planning, and funding. First, we're going to hear from Tanya Everson. Tanya is a statewide manager for the Transportation Alternatives Program. Okay, Tanya, we see your screen now.
Okay. Let's start. Get that off to the side a little more. My name is Tanya Iverson. I've been the statewide multimodal program manager for TAP for about 3 years now. And TAP is the main bike ped funding program at WISDOT. There are lots of bike ped facilities that are put in with other highway projects or other road projects, but this one exclusively funds bike ped. So we'll talk about what the process, it's a grant program, and today we'll talk about what the process is to apply for the funds and what makes for a good application. So the overview for TAP is that it is one of the programs that are part of the formula funds that are part of the omnibus federal transportation bill. And that transportation bill funds everything from the national highway system to safety programs to congestion mitigation to planning at the MPO level. TAP is a subpart of some of that funding. The current transportation bill is the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, or the FAST Act for short. You might have heard other omnibus transportation bill names like ICE-T or MAP 21, or I don't even know some of them, but every couple of years they reallocate and mix with some of these funds in these big bills. The last one got passed in 2015. TAP projects are selected through a competitive application process that the WISDOT administers every other year. So it's every other year we do a new 4-year cycle. So every other year we move out the cycle 4 more years, and we create a list of projects that will fit in theoretically to that 4-year period, and that way we always know what's coming for at least 4 to 6 years. A lot of the projects that you do or that get proposed take almost that long to plan and design and then begin construction. This project this program funds 80% of the construction with a 20% local match, and a lot of the funding is allocated through a statewide process, but each of the large MPO areas, so Green Bay, Appleton, Milwaukee, and Madison, get their own little pot of money that they can decide how they want to spend. Essentially, where am I? Oh, yeah, so mainly the TAP program has, there are a couple other bike ped funds out there. DNR runs administers the other bucket. That's the Rec Trails program. For TAP, largely these are standalone bike ped facilities that serve a utilitarian purpose. So these, a lot of these TAP projects are bike paths, not necessarily just on-road. So, although there are some on-road accommodation projects, there's some bike boulevard project in Milwaukee, and traffic calming things that we do on existing streets. But a lot of these are standalone bike ped projects, maybe putting sidewalks in, maybe doing a connecting path from one larger area that has some facilities on it to another. But mostly they're all utilitarian. That's how we differ from the DNR. These projects, in order to score well at all, need to have a utilitarian purpose, so people need to be using them for transportation, not just recreation. Eligible sponsors for these projects are nonprofits with an emphasis on transportation safety, tribal governments, school districts, the DNR or public land agencies, transit agencies, regional planning commissions, local governments. Examples of the kinds of projects that TAP funds are sidewalks and pedestrian amenities, wayfinding, shared youth paths, bike lanes, bike parking, traffic calming, and generally infrastructure to improve safety for pedestrians and bicyclists. But again, a lot of those, even though on-road accommodation on a road that just got finished would be eligible for TAP, mostly what gets selected are more standalone facilities, so a lot more paths, or things like bike boulevards or wayfinding. Eligible TAP non-infrastructure, TAP, the longer story is 4 years ago, there used to be 3 federal programs. There was a program for transportation enhancements, and those things funded beautiful things like paths and museum exhibits and benches and greenery and made things lovely. And then there was a bike ped program that funded utilitarian bike and pedestrian and safety infrastructure. And then there was a program called Safe Routes to School. And when the last omnibus transportation bill passed, which was MAP 21, the federal government combined all 3 of these programs into one program called TAP, and tried to keep a lot of the eligibility for all the prior programs still intact, but for the most part got rid of a bunch of the transportation enhancements. But they did keep all of the activities surrounding their old program, Safe Routes to School, all still eligible. And in Safe Routes to School, there was an activity that is eligible for funding around encouraging and educating and enforcing pedestrian and bike safety around schools within 2 miles of K-8 schools. That's the only programming dollars that you can use for TAP. You can use TAP dollars for planning, but in terms of programming for bike safety or bike encouragement or bike education, it needs to be related to K-8 schools. And that program was formerly Safe Routes to School. So you can do programming for safety and encouragement and education, or you can do planning for all sorts of different types of facilities. So non-infrastructure types of activities are again, most of the programming stuff only relates to those K-8 schools, relate to the creation and reproduction and promotional and educational materials, training, developing curricula to teach in the schools for kids to ride, learn how to ride bike and bike safety, costs for additional law enforcement, so crossing guards, equipment and training needed to establish a crossing guard program, and then getting consultants to help with planning and creating citywide or district-wide or school-wide specific bike ped plans. So essentially, eligible TAP projects are almost anything that has a utilitarian bike ped purpose, and as long as it's for kids, also some programming related to bike ped. Planning is certainly eligible, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But I wanted to just sort of talk about some of the ways that TAP has sort of changed recently and some of the things that have happened that makes it seem like a sort of a harder program to get into and harder projects to complete, and why that is and what you can do to be more successful in your application and be more successful if you do get an approved application. So right here is essentially how the Wisconsin Department of Transportation relates to the federal funding that it administers. So once a project is approved at WSDOT, it's listed in a TIP or a STIP, and those are lists of projects that FHWA or the US DOT needs to see in order to say, okay, we'll accept that that's your project, and eventually we'll authorize that project and give you some money. So it gets into this little list of projects, and that list of projects is updated almost every month, and then very thoroughly once a year. A couple weeks, about 6 weeks before the project is supposed to be let or funds are really supposed to be made available, FHWA authorizes it. It says, okay, you can begin your project, and then on a given date, they release their funds in their funding system. At that point, then the entity, the local unit of government, the RPC, the school district, the nonprofit safety organization, they can begin incurring costs on their project. They need to first pay for all of the project and then request reimbursement to WSDOT. WSDOT reimburses the LPA is the local project administrator, so it's the person who got the grant or the entity that got the grant. So WSDOT reimburses the LPA, and then WSDOT requests reimbursement from FHWA, and FHWA reimburses WSDOT. So a couple of things that have happened sort of over the course of time with TAP projects and projects generally, but in particular TAP, is that we only can spend funds that we have obligated or encumbered, or if we go back here that we have where we obligate those funds. You'll see it's right here. Until that moment, even if we've approved a project, we don't get funds until step 4 of this process. And so what that means is that if we're, and you have to be far enough along in your project that you're essentially ready to begin constructing in order to have those funds more or less released. So you have to be through occasionally a pretty onerous environmental process. You have to have procured you have to have your design done, and a whole bunch of stuff has to happen before you can get your money for your construction. And so a lot of times what had been happening is projects were sort of stalling out in design, or maybe in the environmental, or maybe there were real estate issues that the local units of government hadn't necessarily considered. And so for a number of years we were committing to doing a lot of projects, but we weren't actually getting to the point where we were ready to obligate those funds. And we were leaving a lot of money on the table that would go back into other projects that were ready to spend the funds that weren't necessarily maybe in TAP. So what has happened is when we took a look at the program and we realized what we want to do is make sure we are spending that money in an effective way so that we're making sure we get as many TAP projects, that we commit as much money to these TAP projects as we possibly can. We need to get them to the point where they are ready to have their funds obligated in a timely way. So to get to that point, FHWA and WSDOT put a few fiscal and time constraints into the program that move the projects along a lot faster. And one of the things they did is they created a commencement deadline. In 2014, the state legislature said that all projects, all TAP projects, must begin by 4 years from the date in which they were approved. And so that means from the time your application is approved, you have 4 years to begin your construction. And that seems like an amazingly long amount of time, but it really, really isn't. In fact, you have to be incredibly diligent and have all your ducks in a row and not miss a beat in order to even hit that. And so what that has meant is we have we've sort of changed what kinds of projects are eligible to compete in the program. The other thing that has happened is we now say that the projects must be done within 6 years, and that just further emphasizes the kinds of projects that are eligible to compete in the TAP process. So with the 4-year commencement and the 6-year sunset, we now have a situation where, and this is a little bit more about what is commencement, we now have a situation in which, actually I'll let you read that, a situation in which only projects that come in far enough along such that they know if they're going to encounter any problems with their environmental or with any real estate or with railroads, will they even be considered for application. The other thing that has become, the other thing that makes a project more competitive is if the local unit of government or the entity that's applying for the grant is willing to pay for the design. So it used to be for a number of years you could come in with generally a good idea and flush it out with the grant funds. Now, because of this commencement rule and how competitive the funds are, you really need to have all of your ducks in a row, and you need to almost be ready to go out for a solicitation for your designer and be ready to construct almost immediately in order to be competitive for the funds. And I think the long story here is that I know that there's like the Trail of the Badger and a few other really great trail connection ideas that we see applications for that are not far enough along in their process to commence in a timely way to hit that 4-year mark, and so they're not even considered eligible projects. So the first thing I will say is what has made a successful project has been a project that has been thoroughly vetted and planned for. So the takeaway, I think, is that if you are intending to apply for a TAP project or you have a good idea out there for a route that has a utilitarian purpose, the first thing you'll want to do is connect with or hook up with your regional planning commission or your county highway commissioner to see if it's part of an existing county-wide or region-wide plan. And if it's not part of a county-wide or region-wide plan, you may want to, it's not to say it's not a good idea, you may want to see what you can, you may want to see if there are any archaeological or environmental issues with it. You could, you may want to see if there will be in any way any rail issues. Who owns the right-of-way? In WSDOT world, that means who, if it's along a utility corridor, it might be the utility. If it's along a rail corridor, like there's rail lines nearby, that would be the rail. If it's on a state highway or county highway, it might be WSDOT. So somebody owns the real estate where you want your your path. And so you'll need to vet all of that information out. And so there's a whole lot of preliminary information that you would need to think about even prior to applying for the TAP program in order to ensure that you're not going to hit stumbling blocks. Because, for example, if you have rail coordination and there's any environmental or a rail crossing, that can be enough to make your project not doable in the time frame that's set up here. So I think first and foremost, it's important to remember that in no way is TAP like the seed money for a great idea. TAP is sort of the last step in what has been a several-year planning process, almost always. We kind of come in at the end and fund what has been something that's been planned for and something that's been considered and something that's been pretty well vetted. So this is a project. This is a southeast, that's the Milwaukee area. It's a sample of a construction project, an infrastructure project. There's nothing wrong with it. It's really pretty easy. And these are all of the phases and an optimistic look at how long each phase of a project takes. So you'll see here that let's say the governor, and this was for the last cycle, the governor announced the awards for the last TAP cycle essentially at the end of fiscal year 16 or the beginning of fiscal year 17. SMAs, everyone had about 6 months, which is the grant agreement between the local unit of government and WSDOT, had about 6 months to get their and to execute their grant agreement that they have with us. And after that, projects that were not doing 100% of their own design costs, where WSDOT was paying for the design, they had about another half year, so till about now, to get into a contract with a designer. From that point, the designer will have about a year to work on things like, are there any endangered species in the area? Are there any migratory issues that we need to consider? Is there going to be any wetland mitigation that needs to happen? What are the environmental issues that we need to be concerned about right away? Who has the right of way? Do we need to get easements? Do we need to buy property? What are some of those issues? And all of those have legal things that can take a long time. So they have a little over a year, and that's without anything being weird or crazy to get that underway. And then it's the final design, which gets you almost up until the deadline, which is that red line. So even an easy project that doesn't have any of the normal pitfalls takes almost the entire 4 years to commence. So it's a vigorous process, and really I can't emphasize enough, the only thing that mitigates a lot of those issues and makes sure that your schedule looks like this is if you go through a planning process. So I don't know who else will be in your Bike Civics sessions coming up, but I certainly know that the projects that we selected last time had all been part of a planning process and had been prioritized by the communities and had all of these issues well vetted before they got selected. So some of the things that we look for in a TAP application, a successful TAP application, have score well in all, these sorts of categories. They're all the planning and prep is what we just talked about. They have a utilitarian or are critical to connectivity in terms of some of the other facilities that are in the area. Then they also have either they either benefit environmental justice or economic justice issues. They have a public health impact. They are of historical significance. The projects that get selected are a priority locally. You can see that there has been strong local support. They maybe impact safety if you have safety records for the project, like this has been a place of a lot of accidents. It maybe doesn't qualify for HISA, but we have documented safety concerns at this place. That would help your project score really well. And then the other part is it a novel idea or a unique partnership, and has the project sponsor, the local unit of government that has the project, do they have a history of delivering successful projects? Are they timely? Do they get the stuff done on time, or are they always pushing their projects out? And again, almost all of these ideas can be better vetted with a very thorough planning process. So the next solicitation for TAP applications will begin in October, the end of October of 2017, and awards will be announced in 2018. The projects that we select will be scheduled sometime between 2018 and 2022. The amount of money that we will have available will be a little bit more than about $14 million, provided what the next budget gives us doesn't change what it's been in the past. Each of the projects that we will select in the next cycle will again be held to that 4-year commencement deadline and the 6-year sunset. And there is a minimum project amount of $300,000 for construction and $50,000 for planning or safe routes projects. And that is largely because these projects are considered on the NHS. So they're considered federal projects because we're using federal funds to pay for them. And the federal government really likes a lot of paperwork. If your project is selected, you will go through a training as to what that paperwork is and all of the things that you will be responsible for. But because of the onerous nature of the paperwork and some of that, we make sure that the projects are big enough that they can support, that they justify some of that paperwork. So the funding limit for the construction projects is $300,000. Anyway, in order to get more information about TAP in particular, you can go onto the WISDOT website. You'll see that there are some older, if you go into local program, if you go into assistance programs, other aid, you'll find in their transportation alternatives program, that will be the TAP program. If you go into bike ped generally, you'll see a lot of support and a lot of information on various planning entities and who can support you within each region. If you look at the map to the right, you'll see that there is a planner in each, a bike ped planner in each area of the state. And if you have any questions about a project that you're considering or an idea that you have, these bike ped planners are really, I think, a critical first link to what might be out there. They will know the regional planning commissions, and they will also have a really good sense of the highway commissioners and what plans are out there and who you might need to contact in order to begin thinking about or planning for a project. So in the last cycle that we did, which was 2016 to 2020, we had initially about 100 applications, and I would say a third of them ended up not being eligible because it was determined that they could not timely commence, and of the remaining, we selected about a third. So it's a pretty competitive process, but the one thing I do know is that the projects that, even if they hadn't won in prior cycles, the projects that all did come in and win had been identified as priorities, had maybe even applied for funding before and hadn't gotten in, and had gone back to the drawing board and fixed some of the things or some of the problems that some of the the grant reviewers or the WSDOT engineers had seen with them, and then they came back in to try again. But all of the projects that we selected were local priorities and had a lot of planning behind them and had been around for a while in terms of an idea. I know coming up in the southeast region, the Trail of the Badger will be a big deal. I know that there's some connectivity. I know there's some planning efforts going on in the northeast region, and it's hopeful that some of those will turn into some projects that will maybe connect to the Fox River Trail. I just think that there's you know, a lot of great planning efforts going on right now that could likely result into some really good projects. So I think if you can look or try to capitalize on some of the ideas that are out there regionally, that will also help you if those projects can kind of be framed as something that builds upon the existing bike ped infrastructure out there. That always goes over well. I don't know. I was impressed with how many really great projects were applied for and also how many we did not select. So I know it's certainly competitive, but it's also really exciting, all the great ideas that are out there. If a project is primarily recreational in purpose, it is likely that we would recommend that you also apply to the Rec Trails program, and that is run out of the DNR. So I guess that's about my half hour. Are there questions?
Tanya, we do have one question. I think I'm going to save it for the end, and I want to remind everybody, if you do have a question for either Tanya or Will, who we'll hear for next, please do put it in the tab bar, and I'll be sure to present it at the end. So thank you so much for your information. I'm going to be sure to send links and also have both presentations available on our website as well as the recording. So thank you so much for sharing your information. Now I'm going to pass the screen on to Will. So Will Kratt has a keen interest in multimodal transportation and brings significant experience implementing alternative and innovative design standards while maintaining efficiency and safety. He is excited to work with communities to develop transportation facilities that are more flexible and productive. Will is using alternate design manuals such as those from NACTO and ISG's daily practice with communities and transportation agencies. Will and his team are instrumental in the developing of La Crosse's Parklet Handbook and have used pilot to permanent strategies in the planning and design of local projects. Will understands how transportation network, public and private parking management, and land use policies of all work together to shape a community and its future development, mobility, and equity. He works closely with each of their clients and truly listens to community members to understand their needs, desires, and community development objectives. Will from ISG Designs. Will, I don't see your screen.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Let me see here.
Because it says sharing.
Okay. Oh, yep. I'm sorry. I do see it.
Okay, great. Are we good to get started then?
Please do. Start.
Oh. Okay, so Carolyn reached out to me to talk a little bit about something we've been looking at with the City of La Crosse and their planning department and their bike ped committee. City of La Crosse, just to give you a little bit of a history, has embarked on pretty significant bike ped plans within the city, and then also has begun the steps to implement some of the recommendations from their bike ped plan. And a couple of those were neighborhood greenways in the heart of the city. And while I wasn't involved in the planning process for either the bike ped manuals or the initial concepts for the neighborhood greenways. As Carolyn said, we have been involved a little bit with concepts of taking projects from pilot to permanent stages, working with some alternative design standards such as the NACDO guides. And so we were approached to take a look at this because as we just discussed, with WSDOT, there's the TAP program. There are some other opportunities out there for these types of projects as well. But what do you do, if you don't have an eligible project or you're just not successful in getting that? So the City of La Crosse identified 2 different neighborhood greenways that they wanted to move forward with. One of those was selected to be put into their capital improvement program, and I believe is being constructed in 2017. And just to give you an idea, for several blocks of neighborhood greenway, not only just the elements that make up a safe and efficient greenway, but also the pavement replacement related to it costs millions of dollars. So the Bike Ped Committee and the Planning Department was interested in seeing what options might be available to possibly implement other projects that either aren't successful at obtaining grant dollars at the state or federal level or through nonprofits, or just there isn't room in your community's capital improvement project at this point. So what you see on the screen right here is the proposed King Street Neighborhood Greenway. As you can see, it spans about 15 city blocks within the city of La Crosse from 7th Street to 22nd Street, and it does cross State Trunk Highway 35 as well. So it's not just on purely city facilities, but it would involve a crossing with a state trunk highway. So we were approached to look at what benefits could be provided through interim strategies. Again, so it was explained the long process that has to be carried out for a TAP eligible project and one that's selected. So without the monies and without quite being ready to go through that type of a process yet, they wanted to look at how some of this could be accomplished in the interim. So we also assessed the impacts and proved the concept with a pilot project. And we suggest temporary options for signs, pavement markings, speed management, volume management, street crossings, and green infrastructure, because in the city of La Crosse, their complete streets ordinance also includes green infrastructure components. And many of these have been mentioned, and if you do a project that is eligible for TAP or any other kind of state or federal funding, many of these manuals you will have to follow. I'm not going to read through all of them here, but you will see we've also included some alternative manuals that are available through the National Association of City Transportation Officials. That's also where you can find some information on pilot to permanent and other interim recommendations for these types of projects. Also to note, the City of La Crosse did adopt NACDO guides as an alternative design manual, but I do recommend that if you're taking on this type of project that you still consider all the information available, and if it is your intention to someday apply for TAP or other federal funding for these types of projects, you definitely will want to consider many of the manuals on this list to make sure that you're designing to the proper standards so that your work will be eligible. Specific to this project, the City of La Crosse, as I mentioned before, did have TY Lin International provide concept plans and a memo for what that design could possibly look like in the future. A lot of time and effort was spent looking at the intersection of West Avenue because it is a pretty tricky intersection in this case. It is State Trunk Highway 35, and one block in each direction there's already a signalized intersection. So you'll see a design concept here shortly, but we were told to take a look at what alternative C from that plan would look like. we were to assume a total budget of approximately $50,000. So as I mentioned before, a similar project that's taking place in La Crosse that does also include pavement replacement is costing the city millions of dollars within the capital improvement program. So you can see this is significantly less amount of money. So we right away had to look at what do we have to do to meet that budget. And as I'll go into a little bit more here, we looked at maybe shortening the length of what was the original desired length of the project. So instead of going from 7th to 22nd, going from 7th to West Avenue. And then if there was any money left over, maybe also take a look at another major intersection with 16th Street. So this is the map I showed you before. This is what the city and T.Y. Lynn planned for originally. And based on the monies available, what we looked at was significantly shortening the length, but I'll get into how those assumptions were made. And again, none of this has been approved yet at the city level. They're not ready to move forward with even the pilot project. So these, again, were just recommendations from our design team and still need to be vetted before the city were to move forward with our recommendations. So what do we do to turn a project idea into a pilot project? First, we identify individual permanent elements. So I don't want to give you the impression that there isn't significant amount of planning and design that has to go into this. Really, you do have to have a pretty good idea, in my opinion, of what you're going to do for final design to put a good quality bicycle and pedestrian facility in your community. But what that does then is it allows you to identify temporary replacements for those permanent elements. So as you'll see, those include paint, planters, flexible delineators, which I'll show pictures of, and all sorts of things that are movable, replaceable, and those sorts of conditions. Things to consider when identifying temporary replacements are safety, cost, the expected life, and aesthetics. We feel it's also important to identify options for reuse of materials. It's just another way to stretch that dollar, and you know, while what you're doing might be temporary in nature, a certain percentage of the materials you use might be durable enough to be used elsewhere in your city, either on another pilot project or in another part of the community. Identify the process for pilot to permanent, which I'll go into a little bit what a typical process looks like. Again, a lot of this comes from NACDO guides, and I can tell you a little bit about what we've learned by trying to implement these types of projects. And then also suggest a community engagement feedback loop. So what's going to be real important with a project like this is it is a chance, while there might be some kind of drawbacks to going to a pilot rather than a permanent situation, there's also some really great benefits, I think, from the design side as well. So you can see before spending significant amount of dollars on permanent improvements, what effects are shifted to other roads and intersections. And that's key on this project because that alternative C that we were instructed to move forward with does limit vehicular through movements and turns on King Street. So that might have some negative effects on the signalized intersections nearby. It may not. So that's something that we can look at in real time. And then also just other comments from citizens, users, city staff, DOT staff, and others on the pilot design itself. And really, if there are any tweaks that need to be made, it gives you the opportunity to do that before you go out there and spend a significant more amount of money on the project and put something like concrete in the ground, which is not easy or cheap to replace. So in this specific example, of course, there are compromises here. You can see it right away in the dollars. So it does take you know, city staff and bike ped community and other users to accept the fact that you're accepting reduced funding, but I like to say for now, because I'd be real interested to hear from Tanya and others if anybody has used this strategy before applying for TAP, because it would be an interesting strategy to me on, if allowed, maybe a great way to significantly strengthen your application. It's a temporary investment, not permanent. So again, the key is here, it's not meant to last forever. It's not meant to be the final solution. You can go from very bare bones, which I'll show you in some images, and not very aesthetically pleasing, to things that are much more tolerable for an extended length of time. But again, it's important to note that these are not permanent situations. Also here, we did have to shorten the length of the project to meet the budget, but as somebody who uses this corridor quite a bit, both on my commute and also with my family, I think while the longer route would be great, I think most people can probably agree that the sections west of West Avenue is probably the higher priority here when it comes to safety and comfort. Compromises that are not to be made are safety. Obviously, that's paramount. Whenever we're doing something here, a big part of these types of projects, especially greenways, is getting people more comfortable. So we're not going to realize the benefit of the facility if we don't make it comfortable and safe. And then also, you know, part of the reason that you might want to look at doing something like this is to not lose the momentum. So, you know, the city of La Crosse has invested a lot of time, money, and other resources into their bike ped plan, into looking at these neighborhood greenways, and as we talked about with the TAP program, you know, showing that you're incrementally making steps towards completing your vision is something that's very important, whether it's already in the TAP program or just a project that your community is taking on. You don't want to lose that momentum, and again, it's better than not implementing anything. So I'll talk a little bit more specifically about the project. This is an actual traffic circle on King Street. This one happens to be, I believe, at 19th Street, so it's a little bit further up the corridor, actually outside the scope of what the pilot project would look like based on our recommendations. But it's just to show that this is the type of facility that they're looking at certain intersections. And I'll give you an example of what this could look like in a temporary situation. So here's some pictures from a number of communities throughout the country. You can see, so these yellow and or orange tubes with reflective tape on them, those are flexible delineators that can be used to outline your circle. They've got a number of other rubber and plastic materials that can be used, parking blocks, those sorts of things, paint. You can also see some elements of planters and stuff like that here. If you do want to get a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. But again, there's a balance here between what are you ultimately trying to accomplish, what is your budget, what are you willing to maintain. So I'm not going to go through these numbers real closely, but you can see, you know, we kind of came up with a budget on what each one of these might cost, including paint, flexible delineators, traffic control, those sorts of things. Another element in the plan from T.Y. Lin for the bicycle or the neighborhood greenway was curb extensions. So, you know, they went through a pretty extensive process to determine what should go where, and we just went along with those recommendations for now, just from a budget perspective. So I'm sure many of you are familiar what curb extensions, you know, look like when they're done permanently. But here's some photos of what communities have done in the interim to create curb extensions. So again, you'll notice the use of temporary traffic control devices. You'll notice flexible delineators, paint, and some of the paint is used both to delineate the area, but also to infill the area, so it's noticeable that it's not part of the traveled area on the street. Again, some of them are using planters and vegetation for aesthetics, and you can probably gather from this picture that that there's a wide range of what you can spend on this. Again, the cost to show that, you know, for an intersection, it could be done fairly reasonably. And then this is alternative C from the previous concept plan showing the West Avenue crossing. So West Avenue is a 5-lane road in this section. What alternative C does is it restricts all left turns on West Avenue, and it restricts all cross auto traffic on King. But it does provide a cut through on either side for both pedestrians and bicyclists. Again, this one is going to be definitely probably the most expensive to do. We're looking at a number of different things here, such as flexible delineators, paint. You might even be looking at jersey barrier. That would all have to be coordinated with DOT and the city, but just giving you an idea here. And so ultimately showing what is slightly over budget, but hopeful that the city of La Crosse can maybe look at putting some of these facilities onto at least 6 intersections within the corridor and get them closer to achieving their vision of a neighborhood greenway on King Street. So just to summarize, and then we can probably go to questions, what you see here is a table out of the Urban Street Design Guide from NACTO that talks a little bit about how a pilot's permanent approach is slightly different than the traditional approach. I would add that some of the design that you see there in year 3 really does need to go up into between year 1 and year 2. They talk about concept and plan and outreach, but again, I think to really put yourself on a good path forward, a lot of that design needs to be done ahead of time so that you know that what you're putting out there is very similar to what's going to be accepted permanently. You need to identify individual permanent elements, identify temporary replacements for those, really think about how you can reuse the materials, which helps justify the costs and maybe reduces the cost for future pilot projects. You need to really understand the process for pilots permanent, and it could be different in each community. So you have to decide as a community, you know, what length of time you're designing for, and then again, kind of design your own feedback loop process as well, so that you know, when it's implemented, you can either tweak it in further years or make improvements to the design prior to spending the big investment on the permanent project. So with that, I'll wrap up, Carolyn, and we can take any questions.
Okay, thank you so much. If there are any questions, please do put them in the chat box. I'm going to start with some questions for Tanya. The first question was, are TAP funds available for bike lane size snowplows or sweepers? Tanya, can you unmute yourself?
Nope, I did unmute myself. You know, I don't know that anyone's asked. Certainly, we expect the bike lanes to be, or the bike paths to be maintained, especially if they're in an urban area and are primarily used for commuting. But I don't know that we've ever paid for maintenance equipment. I guess that would be really something I'd have to look at. I know we pay for other equipment in terms of like bike shares and stuff like that. So certainly capital equipment isn't prohibited, but I don't know the answer. If you could email me that question, I'll look into it.
Okay, wonderful. I will do that. And the next question also for you, Tanya, is from somebody who says, we have a small half-mile paved road needed to connect a road into a park. Is that too small of a project?
It will depend a lot on what that facility has to look like. If that half-mile paved road or paved path that you need to build is boardwalk through a wetland or has a rail crossing attached to it, like the cost can go up pretty significantly. So I think what the issue is it might not, if it's just sort of paved path along some existing right-of-way, and it's, you know, it might not get to 300,000, but you'd be surprised at how expensive these projects can get pretty quickly. So I don't know. You would have to, somebody who does delivery on those sorts of things would be better at estimating what a half mile looks like, because no half mile is created equally. But if the sum of what the project would be is $300,000 or more, it would certainly be a TAP eligible project. And if you could make the argument that that's critical to connectivity, or from that park there are other paths that it connects to, then that would certainly be an eligible TAP project.
Okay, wonderful. I don't see any other questions, but if anyone does have a question, feel free to send it to me in an email, and I will pass it on. Oh, it looks like there is one more question for Will, but I don't see what the question.
Can I offer up one comment to Will? I will say that two of our projects, the Bike Boulevard of our recently approved TAP project, two of our projects, a Safe Routes to School project in Abbotsford and the Bike Boulevard project in Milwaukee, both had some temporary stuff that they had been working with for the last couple of years. And they were able to comment on, reflect on, and use, kind of capitalize on the fact that they had, in Milwaukee, they had put in some temporary things to create a bike boulevard, and in Abbotsford, they had created like a walking school bus program and had done a whole bunch of encouragement things around Safe Routes to School, and had the plan all set up. So they had implemented some temporary, less expensive things as well, and that really helped make their application sort of rise to the top. So I think his instinct is good that these temporary things show momentum, show commitment, and can also demonstrate some early success. So I think that was true.
Wonderful. So here is a question for Will. Why did you shape your budget to $50,000 if your project seems to be a construction one?
So $50,000 was the number that we were given by the city, and I think that's just simply a line item within their either current capital improvement budget or in some other budget that the Bike Ped Committee would be allowed to, if they all agreed it was for the right purpose. So again, we were limited here in the design and scope of the project by that $50,000. So I agree. You know, if we were to implement the entire project or go straight to permanent, we're looking at a budget magnitudes of order larger, because I will agree with Tanya that you'd be amazed how quickly this stuff can add up, especially once you're out there doing it permanently. But so it was just a limitation that was given to us by the community. Did that answer the question, do you think, Carolyn? Carolyn, you still there?
Oh, sorry, I am here. Yes, I did get a thank you. And I want to thank the presenters and all the participants for joining in. And I will be sure to send some links with the presentations and the resources, and also a reminder for next week about where to call in and who the presenters will be. So thank you, everybody, for joining today's GoToMeeting. See you next week.
Thank you.